My name is Warski, and I would like to talk today about Supler. I was supposed to do this together with Tomasz Szymanski, but unfortunately he'll be coming only tomorrow for his microservices talk, so I'll have to do this alone. Hopefully it won't take twice the time, but we'll see. Okay, so I guess we can start. So first, I guess many people can wonder what Supler actually is. So Supler is a library which we wrote. It's a we can say it's a rapid form development library which makes writing complex forms easier. So we wrote a couple of systems for various clients where we ended up writing our own libraries or frameworks for form management. In those systems, the forms were quite large and complex, so existing tools and web frameworks were not enough. So we did this a couple of times, but this is all closed source. So we decided that this time we will do it right, and we will do it in open source. And that's how Supler came to life. So Supler consists of two parts. It's on the backend, you can use a Scala DSL for defining the forms. And on the front end, you have a JavaScript form renderer. And the two communicate using JSON, a very simple JSON protocol. Just to explain more or less before we start coding how Supler works, that's a rough graph showing how a typical Supler interaction may look like. So an important part in the Supler is that it's very focused on handling only the form part. So it's not like a complete web framework or anything like that. It handles only forms. Okay, so that means that you can use it with any web framework, well, any Java web framework or Scala web framework, and you can use any JavaScript libraries frameworks on the front end. Okay. So on this diagram, you have like two distinct parts. The green ones with the rounded corners are things that you have to do by hand or that your framework has to provide. And the squares is what Supler provides. Okay? So first, when a user opens the page, right, we're over here, a request comes to our server that the user wants to see the form. So the first thing we have to do is we have to determine the backing object, right? So let's say it's a person form, so we have to determine the person that the user wants to see. So we have to look it up in a database or something like that. And how you do that is completely up to you. Like Supler is not concerned with this at all. But once we have the object, we can define a form with the Supler's DSL, where the fields are defined and so on, and we can apply that form to the object, generating JSON. That JSON is then passed to the front end. It is rendered using our JavaScript form renderer on the front end. Then the user may interact with the form, change fields, and so on. In the end, the form is serialized to a JSON form, and it is sent to the backend. Again, how this network communication is done is entirely up to you, and it is not handled by Supler. The only thing Supler gives you is a serialized form in the JSON on the front end, and a way to apply the JSON on the backend. Okay? And then, so this there can be like several iterations. You can modify the form and it is sent back, and then an updated form is sent back to the client, right? Some client-side validation is done. And in the end, again, once the user clicks the save button, we again validate on the server side everything, and then you can save the object to the database using a callback. We will see how this all works in a second. Okay, so we saw more or less what Supler is, and I would again like to emphasize what Supler is not. So it is not a web framework, it is not a persistence framework. It doesn't define in any way the life cycle of your objects. That's up to you to define. It doesn't handle the client-server communication and so on. Okay? Also, I think what is important is that Supler is tailored for complex web forms. So if you have some simple web forms like login forms or simple register forms and so on, you should probably use whatever web framework tools you have, right? So if you're using Play or Grails or Spring, for simple forms, these cases are quite well covered. So Supler is for the more complex case where there are many dependencies in the form, where things have to be conditionally rendered, where there are subforms, and things like that. Okay, so last slide before we get to see some actual code. Just a short note about us so that you know more or less who's talking to you. So both me and Tomek, who is absent, we are co-founders and coders at SoftwareMill, which is a software house based in Poland. We all work remotely, so we don't have like a single place from which we work. We do quite a lot of Scala and Java stuff. We are a TypeServe consulting partner. We also do some open source projects. One of them is Supler. I also did other things like Envers, MacWire. We both have blogs and Twitter accounts, so feel invited to visit. And yeah, so let's see Supler in action. Okay, so I have an example model here. If you would have any questions, like regarding Scala or Supler or anything, just feel free to ask. So I have an example model that we are going to use. So it's quite simple. We have a troll, right? A troll has a name, a height, an optional life story, and gender. Gender is an enumeration with 2 values. And we have an example instance of a troll, right, which we are going to use. So we are not going really to interact with a true database. We are just going to use an in-memory store, which is an instance in an object, which is quite simple. So that's our model with which we are going to work with. And yeah, let's define a form which will allow us to edit troll's details. Okay, so I will create a forms wrapper object, and let me import the Supler DSL. Okay. And now we can define the form, okay? So we will define a troll form. A troll form will be a form that comes from Supler, and it takes a type parameter, which is the class, the type of the objects which we are going to edit, so that's a troll, right? And we get a builder object here, and we have to return a list of fields. Okay, so the first field will be the first name. So you can notice that we get code completion here. So everything is type safe. And we need to attach a label, first name. So that's our first field. The second field will be height. And again, let's label height centimeters. And we can attach some validators. That it has to be greater than 100 and less than 299. Okay, so that's the allowed heights for trolls. Trolls are born 1 meter high, apparently. Then we have an optional field, which is the bio. And we add a label. Okay. And finally, we will have a select field for the gender. So the select one field, we select the gender. Now we have to provide a way to convert a gender to a label. So we are just going to use toString because enumeration has toString implementation. And we have to provide the possible values for genders. So the possible values are gender values to list. Okay. And label gender. Okay. So that's our server-side form definition. Okay. So once we have that, we need to somehow expose this to the client via HTTP API, let's say. Okay. So again, I have a very simple server here. This one uses Spray, but you can use anything. You can use JAX-RS, you can use Play, you can use Spring, anything you like, really. You can use Spring in Scala or in Java. So currently the server the things that are written is serving some static content from the resource directory, right, and redirecting to the index when we open the root path. So let's add some more logic here. So we will add an endpoint, which is rest /from1.json. And when we invoke that, that will be a get JSON, and what we return. So that's a get endpoint, right? Get, so it combines a get directive saying that we only can get things. It supports the get method and the path. So so when the endpoint is invoked, we want to respond by returning the form description in JSON. Okay, so let me import the forms that the form that we have just written, and I will also import the instance. If you remember, we had one troll ready there. Okay, so that value comes from over here, right? So what we do now is we take the troll form that we have just defined a second ago, and we apply it to a model object, so to a troll instance, okay? So now we have a form that is applied to an object. So it's like a form with fields filled with values. Okay, and we are going to generate JSON which corresponds to that form with values. And that's all we need to do on the server side. We also need to do something on the front end, right, to actually display the thing. So I have again a web page ready, which contains just some boilerplate to display a bare Bootstrap index page. So you can see that we are importing Bootstrap here, some IE stuff and so on. The things that are important here is that we have one div which has the ID form container, and here we are importing the Supler frontend JS, and also our forms JS, which we are going to write right now. So to actually display something on the front end, first we need to look up the form container. Document get element by ID. We are going to look up form container, right? So that's the div that you saw. Now our form is going to be new supler.form, form container, and no options right now. And when the document is ready, we are going to run a function, and that function is going to get our REST endpoint, okay? Once we receive the JSON form description from our server, we are going to render it to the user. Okay, so that form is our JavaScript form renderer coming from Supler. We are also going to do something demo only, which is show the JSON that comes from the server, so that you can see what kind of data actually is generated by Supler. Okay, so let's run that server, and now we can see that Scala is compiling, which is always a part of everyday life of every Scala developer. And yes, everything got started up. Okay, so we can now try refreshing that. And you can see that we have a form with 4 fields, right? Just as we have defined. We have the name, height, bio, and gender. You can see the JSON that we received from the server. It's quite simple, not a lot of surprises here. I guess it's quite readable to anybody who reads it, right? So we have an array of fields. Each field has things like a name, a label, a type, the validations that it has, right? So the first name was a string, and so it is required. If it was an option string, it wouldn't be required, right? So bio has validate required false, right? So we get the required validation is handled by the optional by the option wrapper. Here we have some other validations concerning height and so on. So I guess the JSON is quite self-explanatory, but it is like a custom Supler format. And you can also see that if I try to edit and enter an incorrect value, I get a validation error. And that's a client-side validation because we didn't really define any way to communicate with the backend, right? So this has to be run on the front end, and it, in fact, is run on the front end. OK, so once we have that, we can try adding some more logic so that we are actually able to send data back to the server. So to do that, we need to add two things. So first, what we need to do is add a save button. Okay. So now we will add a save action. So we'll add an action, supler.action. So now this will be a standalone field, unlike the previous field, which was all of the previous fields were like embedded in the form, right? And the idea of the action is going to be save. So that's not JavaScript, so double. So now giving a troll to save, we are going just to print line persisted the troll, okay, and we are going to return an custom action result, which for now we are just going to return nothing. We can return any custom data here, like to display to the user or things like that. And we are going to add a label, which is save, and we are going to validate the whole form before running the action. Okay, so now that we have like a standalone field, we can create a troll form with save, which is our troll form plus save action. Okay, so that's like a method invocation on the troll form, and it adds a field to the form. Okay, so what is important about all the Supler forms and fields is that they are all immutable, and they are like quite simple objects which describe the form. So you can compose the form out of existing fields. You can compose the form out of subforms, which we'll see later. So there's like nothing magical going on here. So that's just a value which you can take. You can customize it with a different label. You can customize it with validations. You will get new copies. So everything, there's like no mutation going anywhere. You can take this field and use it in multiple forms. You can take this form and take it in multiple other forms and so on. Okay, so we have the troll form with save. So we're going to use that when getting the description. We also need, in addition to the get, we will now also support post. So when we receive a post, we parse the body as a JValue, which is a JSON in Scala. And now we are going to complete. So again, troll form with save. We apply it to the initial state, which is the troll. Now we process the received data. So the process method takes JSON, which is JSON, which describes changes which should be done to the form, and applies them to the object and runs any actions, okay? And returns an updated form. So when we have an updated form, the only thing we need to do is return the, again, generate a JSON description of the modified form and send it back. Okay, so that's our endpoint for actually persisting, right? Our business logic of actually doing something in response to the user actions is over here in the save action. And here we are just calling process, right? So if the JSON indicates that an action should be run, this action will be actually run. Okay, so that's what we have to do on the backend. And on the front end, what we have to do is we have to add some way of sending data back to the client, right? So here again, we can do it in any way that we like. I'm going to use jQuery again, but it's like up to you. You have to provide that. So we have to provide a send form function, which I'm going just to copy paste because it's boring JavaScript. So here we just have a post to our endpoint, right? So that's the same endpoint. It's a post. So this function receives the form as a JavaScript object. So we convert it to JSON and we send it to the backend. Okay? So that's the changes that we need to do on the backend. And hopefully, now if we run things, and okay, and if we refresh, we now see that the save button is here. Okay, so if we click save, nothing happens here because we didn't redefine any client-side behavior, but we should see that here we get the message, right, that we wanted, so that the troll is persisted. We can try changing some stuff like that, right? So we can see that the changes are here as well, okay? An interesting thing, of course, is what actually gets sent to the server. So the JSON here is much simpler. So when we received JSON from the server, so it was like a complete form description. Here we're just sending the values, right? So it's quite a simple JSON corresponding almost exactly to our object, right? So we have a first name, height, bio, and so on, right? And here we have an indication that the action should be run. Okay, so that's like the very basics of Supler. But as I said, its main goal is to support complex forms. So as we only have 10 minutes left, I will just run a more complex example and explain what happens there. So now if we try to run a bigger example, it's still about trolls. Yeah, and it's running. Okay, so the modifications in this example, the main modification is here we have the trolls. Let me hide that. Okay, so we have the troll like we had before. Okay, but now trolls get an additional field. They get a list of mountains that they like. Okay, and the mountain has a name, height, country, name of the range of the mountain range in the country. And so on. So here we have here we have the same troll with some example mountains that he likes, and we have 3 example mountains. Okay, so that's again, I guess the model is quite simple. But now, since like by default, Supler knows how to display string fields, int fields, and so on, but it doesn't have a clue how to actually handle mountain type fields, right? So we have to somehow provide a form to handle the mountain case. And if we look at the form definition, you can see, let's first look at the troll form, right? So you can see that there are some well-known constructs, like over here we have the first name, right? We have the bio, we have the select one field for the gender, but we also have a subform, okay? So a subform takes a field of any type. It's usually some compound entity, right? And we have to provide a form which will render an element of that subfield, right? It can be a list of fields, it can be an option, it can be a single subform, but we have to provide a form which will render that a form for that entity. So that subform is exactly the same kind of form like the troll form, right? So again, here we have the form for the mountain. It's like the same, exactly the same constructs, right? The mountain form has no idea that it's being embedded into anything, so we can reuse it in multiple places if we need to. Like it uses the same things as over here, okay? So let's see how it looks. So here, like, there's a bit more added than just the subforms, but of course the subforms are over here, right? You can see that currently it's rendered as a table, and it has some action buttons, so we can add and delete mountains as we see fit. We can edit the fields and we can save them on the client side, right? If we try to save, we now get some validation errors on the client side, and then they are checked again on the backend. So that's how subforms are handled. One important thing is how this all actually works. So when I click the button over here, so what actually happens is that Supler sends a request to the backend saying add mountain button was clicked, right? And there's some code which is actually being run. So here you can see the add mountain action, right? And the action body is to add an empty mountain to the mountains list. Okay, so that's done on the server side, and then a new form description is generated and sent back to the client, and the form is re-rendered. Okay, the user, like, except for the fact that there's an AJAX request, the user doesn't really see the re-rendering. So the fact that the logic is in code on the server side, has a couple of important implications. The most important one is that it's quite easy to do fields where the fields whose state depends on the overall entity state, right? As we can see here, for example, we have one dropdown with the country, and we have another dropdown with the mountain range, right? So there are different mountain ranges in Norway and different in Poland. So if we try to change that, and if you try to select Poland as a country, you can see that the content of this dropdown changed, right? How does this work? Well, again, in code, it's quite simple. So you can see that in the mountain form over here, right, we have one dropdown for the country over here, right? And again, when we look at the possible values, you can see that it's like a static list, right? The list is always the same. But here, we have another dropdown, which is the mountain range. And here, the possible values depend on the selected country, okay? So what happens is that when the country is changed, right, the value is like the values coming from the frontend are applied to the entity. So now the m.country is changed to what was selected on the front end, and when the form is serialized to a JSON description again, the values here will be different. Okay? So it's quite easy to do fields which depend on one another. Okay? You can also do conditional rendering. You can do things like hiding a form conditionally. You can also construct a form dynamically depending on the state of the entity if there's a need. Here, like just to show a couple of other things, here we can see another type of action which doesn't require validation and only mutates a field, right? So it's a grow action which actually changes the height of the troll, right? So we can see it in action here. So we have a button, and if you press it, you can see that the height increases. Another important thing is how is rendering handled. So customizing rendering can be done on mainly on the front end. On the back end, you have a limited set of options. So by default, fields are rendered one after another, right? But you can also combine them with the double pipe operator. Why the double pipe? Well, in Scala, you can use any ASCII character as a method name, and we just had to do it because we can. So we have the double pipe here, right, which will render fields side by side. And you can see here that the first name and last name are rendered side by side. Another thing is you can do some render hints. So by default, the subforms are rendered as a table, but we can actually render them as a list. And once we change that, the subforms will be rendered a bit differently. So, okay, so instead of a table, like here, if I refresh, now you can see that it's a list of subforms, okay? And you can, of course, do subforms embedded in subforms and so on. But you can also customize rendering on the front end. So in the HTML, you can provide custom HTML and custom JavaScript to actually render your form. So here we have an example of HTML-based rendering. So we can provide templates which are scoped to like a specific field, or they can be scoped by type of the field, or they can be scoped by the render field of the field. So there are many options to actually match the field. They also have different granularity. So you can just provide a template on how to render a label. You can provide a template how to render the field overall, or just the input part, and so on. So here we provide the template on how to render the field overall, right? And we say that to render the first name field, right, create a div and put the label inside an italic block and add some text here, and then render the input and then render the validation part, okay? And then we can provide other templates which will actually customize the input. We can also provide some custom JavaScript which will do the same but in code, so we can do lots of various stuff. By default, there's a renderer which outputs Bootstrap 3 compatible things. So there's a couple more things that Supler has, but I have 0 seconds left. So So before you go to drink beer, I have some stickers to give away. Two types of stickers. One, if you are interested in doing code reviews, we have an open source code review tool called CodeBrag. And it has a very nice motto, I'm proud of my code. So I have some stickers saying that you are proud of your code. You probably are, hopefully. And another thing is Scala Times, which is our weekly Scala newsletter. So if you're interested in Scala, it's a weekly collection of links that we think are interesting. And there are some nice stickers of that too. And Supler, of course, is open source. There are some docs which explain all the advanced features, and they have also like a basic walkthrough on how to create a very simple Supler form. So if you'd like to see that, you can go there. Everything is on GitHub. If you go to Supler.io, it will actually go to GitHub, so you can clone it, you can contribute, you can create issues, you can go to Gitter, because Gitter is what everybody uses now to talk to each other. And yeah, I guess that's all. If you would have any questions, I'm here, and Tomek will be here tomorrow as well for the rest of the conference. So yeah, thanks a lot.